Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 13. My people have abandoned me, the source of living water, and dug for themselves broken cisterns that cannot hold water. Now, we often may think, how is it possible that Jehovah's people, after all they saw, all they experienced, could leave Jehovah and look for wisdom and support elsewhere? And yet it happened over and over again. Is there a lesson and a warning for us? Well, yes, there is. Today, we appreciate so much all of the spiritual provisions that we're receiving from Jehovah through his organization. Travel all around the world, and our brothers and sisters say they have never felt closer to Jehovah's organization than they do now. That we're receiving life-giving waters of truth as we never have before. But even so, just as in Jeremiah's time, some of our dear brothers and sisters are leaving Jehovah or have left Jehovah and the pure waters of truth and pursued worthless things. How can that happen? How do we make sure that does not happen to us? Well, did you notice the point in our text comment, the first two sentences? It says this. It says, Satan the devil is intent on neutralizing the life-giving guidance we receive from Jehovah. Moreover, our own treacherous heart could interfere with how well we respond to Jehovah's directives. Now, when I think of that statement, the treacherous heart, how we respond to Jehovah's directives, I cannot help but think of Solomon. Now, we know Solomon's account, how Jehovah blessed him, gave him everything he needed to be obedient, but Solomon ended up losing his precious record with Jehovah. He abandoned the source of living water. Now, Solomon started off so well. What happened to him? Well, exactly what our text is talking about here today. He allowed his treacherous heart to interfere with Jehovah's directives. Now, the directives that Jehovah gave Solomon were very, very clear. Look at, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And as we remember, as the king, he was supposed to read this law on a regular basis, write this law on a regular basis. Deuteronomy 17, verse 16 and 17. It says, however, he, and the context is talking about the king, should not acquire many horses for himself. Verse 17, neither should he take many wives for himself, so that his heart may not go astray, nor should he acquire vast amounts of silver and gold for himself. Do not acquire horses, wives, vast amounts of silver and gold. Solomon did all three. You look at Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 3. There Jehovah says, do not form marriage alliances with the nations because they will lead you astray. What did Solomon do? Well, look over to 1 Kings chapter 11 and look at verses 1 through 3. 1 Kings 11, 1 through 3, it says, but King Solomon loved many foreign women, besides the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women. They were from the nations about whom Jehovah said to the Israelites, you must not go in among them, and they should not come in among you, for they will surely incline your heart to follow their gods. But Solomon clung to them and loved them. And he had 700 wives who were princes and 300 concubines, and his wives gradually inclined his heart, just as Jehovah said. Now, how did this happen? Solomon did not just fall into sin. Solomon just didn't, in a moment of weakness, he didn't just wake up one day and realize, oh my word, I have 700 wives and 300 concubines. If he did, Solomon had more problems than we thought he did. No, Solomon was an intelligent man. This was a man who was blessed by Jehovah with wisdom. How did he deviate so far? Well, it was a series of decisions, one after another, that differed from Jehovah's directives that somehow he was able to explain away, rationalize away, until he was completely alienated from Jehovah. Now, we don't know what was going through Solomon's mind or how he made those decisions, but even from our limited perspective, we can see how that could have happened. For example, he starts off talking about the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, he took the daughter of Pharaoh as a wife, but interestingly, in 1 Kings chapter 3, it relates how Jehovah granted him all the wisdom and blessed him. Well, that was after he had taken the daughter of Pharaoh as a wife. So was it possible Solomon thought, well, you know, Jehovah still blessed me. Must be everything is okay. Now, Solomon knew something wasn't quite right there, because in 2 Chronicles chapter 8 and verse 11, it says he had to build another house for her. She couldn't live in the house of David because of the ark. It was holy. She was a foreigner. and couldn't live there. He knew something wasn't quite right, but he was able to make the decision and rationalize it away anyway. It says that he loved Moabite women. Now, as we know, the Moabites were enemies of Jehovah, but not all of them. For example, you may remember that when when David was on the run from King Saul, he asked the king of Moab if he could bring his father and mother, David's father and mother there, and the king of Moab protect them. And they did so the whole time that David was in the stronghold, the account says. So that means the king of Moab protected Solomon's grandparents. We also remember Ruth. Well, Ruth was Solomon's great-great-grandmother, and she was a Moabite woman. And look how well that turned out. And also men from Moab and Ammon were part of David's mighty men. So they weren't all bad. So was it perhaps through David's mighty men, or maybe from his grandparents who stayed in Moab, that he was introduced to some of his first wives from Moab? He talks about Ammonite women. Well, we remember Solomon's son Rehoboam, who later became king. He was born from an Ammonite woman. And interestingly, he was born before Solomon became king. So again, is it possible that Solomon reasoned, well, Jehovah's blessing me, I got an Egyptian wife, an Ammonite wife, maybe this doesn't apply to me like it does everybody else? What about Sidonians? Well, we know the Sidonians were famous for their craftsmanship. They had outstanding abilities as loggers and lumbermen. In fact, Solomon's father, David, used the Sidonians to bring lumber in great quantity for the temple. Solomon later established contracts with the Sidonians to cut trees for the temple. Well, was it through possibly some of these business relationships that he first was introduced to some who became his wives? Could he have reasoned that, well, marrying these Sidonian women, well, that'll help ensure that Jehovah's house is completed. This will help me fulfill my theocratic assignment. And just one more, what about the Hittite women? Well, we remember Uriah. David committed adultery with Bathsheba and had Uriah put to death. Bathsheba became Solomon's mother. Uriah was a Hittite and one of David's mighty men. So that means Solomon's mother had been married to a Hittite man. So is it perhaps through Bathsheba, through her former in-laws, or perhaps through others where Solomon was introduced to some of his first wives from the Hittites? Now, we don't know what Solomon was thinking, but we can see how it was possible for him to begin to rationalize some of those early decisions until he found himself on a slippery slope, completely alienated from Jehovah. So what's the lesson for us? Well, we read this account of Solomon accumulating all of those wives, all the riches, all of those horses, and it's like watching a car crash in slow motion. We know exactly where it's heading, but Solomon didn't see it coming. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what would the reaction be if somebody was reading my life story right now, the decisions that I am making day to day right now? You see, our heart, too, is treacherous. Our heart will try to cause us to rationalize away Jehovah's clear directive. Sometimes we may rationalize a decision because we see we're still getting blessings from Jehovah. Or maybe rationalize a decision because we see how it worked out for somebody else or what somebody else is doing. Dangerous. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to do what Solomon said and should have done himself. If you turn to Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 5. Let's turn there together. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 5. It says, "Trust in Jehovah with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding." Do not rely on your own understanding, on our own wisdom. Trust in Jehovah. Follow his direction. And if we do, we can be assured that we will never abandon the source of living water, but rather will benefit from his guidance for all eternity.